In this video, we're going to go through a bunch of practice questions to help you improve your reading comprehension for the GED test. Along the way, I'm going to give you tips here to help you boost your score, and we're going to go over basic skills and strategy for fiction and other passages. So let's get started here with the first passage. It says, "At the lake shore, there was another rowboat drawn up. The two Indians stood waiting. Nick and his father got in the stern of the boat, and the Indians shoved it off, and one of them got in to row. Uncle George sat in the stern of their camp rowboat. The young Indian shoved the camp boat off and got in to row Uncle George." Okay, so the first question here is, what's the setting? And I'd like you to pause the video, try to figure out the setting, and if I read too fast or too slow for you throughout the video, feel free to either fast forward or pause and take your time and read it as slow as you need to. So pause the video, try this out, and then we'll go over it. Okay, so the setting here is the lake shore. Now, setting is a really important concept to nail down here whenever you're reading a piece, and setting is relevant for fiction, but also nonfiction, depending on what kind of nonfiction you're reading here. But the setting is basically where the story takes place, and it can also be when. So in this case, we're not told much other than that it's taking place on a lake shore or at a lake shore here. But the setting is really important because it's going to help you form a better mental picture of where the story is taking place and when the story is happening. And so just a quick tip here, a lot of people have trouble reading fiction and following it because they miss details that tell them when the setting is changing. And so if you can just keep track of the setting and whenever it changes throughout a story, it's going to really help you understand what's happening. Okay. So the second question is about the same passage, and it says, how many characters were introduced in this paragraph? Please list them. And so you can write them out or you can just do it in your head. But either way, I'd like you to pause the video, try to answer the question, and then we're going to go over it. Okay, so the answer here is 5. And so it's the two Indians, and then we have Nick's father, and then also Uncle George. And so it's really important to keep track of the characters, and I know that it can be hard, other than losing track of the setting, not being able to keep track of who all the different characters are is also another reason why a lot of people have trouble with reading comprehension. So it's just something, whenever you're reading a story, nail down that setting and ask yourself, who are the characters? Okay, so the next question asks, what's the point of view of the story? A, first person, B, second person, or C, third person. So pause the video, try to figure this out, and then we'll go over it. So the answer here is third person, and first person would be, a dead giveaway would be if the person telling the story used the word I, and they said I did this, or I saw this. That would indicate that it was first person. Second person, it's very rare that you would deal with second person. In a lot of stories, especially on the GED, it could happen, but it's unlikely. And then third person is very typical to deal with. Third person is when the person telling the story, they're not playing any kind of active role in the story. They're not using the word I or anything like that. And really the reason why this matters is because in first person, the person telling the story, they can either be a reliable narrator or they could be an unreliable narrator who's either giving you false information, or they could be biased or something like that. But typically, in third-person point of view, it's kind of like watching a movie, right? It's just showing you the scenes as they play out here, and there's not really like a person that's telling the story with any kind of bias or anything like that. Okay, so moving forward here, the next passage reads, the two boats started off in the dark. Nick heard the oarlocks of the other blank quite a way ahead of them, in the mist. The Indians rowed with quick, choppy strokes. Nick lay back with his father's arm around him. It was cold on the water. The Indian who was rowing them was working very hard, but the other boat moved further ahead, in the mist all the time. Okay, so I'd like you to pause the video, and the question here is, which of the following words best fits into the blank? And this is a proven method to increase your reading comprehension called closed deletions, just so you know that the technique that we're doing right now is something that's going to help you out. So pause the video, think this one through, take all the time you need, and we'll go over it. Okay, so the answer here is boat. So it says, Nick heard the oarlocks of the other boat quite a way ahead of them in the mist. So you might have thought Indian could be another answer here. Nick heard the oarlocks of the other blank quite a way ahead of them in the mist. And I guess to figure this out, you'd really have to understand that oarlocks or oars are things that, oars are what you would use to row the boat. Oarlocks, I'm assuming, are like locks that they maybe have the oars locked onto or something like that. Not 100% sure what the word oarlocks even means here, but you would just have to note that this is not talking about the Indian, it's talking about the boat here. And Uncle George, that was just, that doesn't really fit the context here. Okay, so the next question says, the Indian who was rowing them was blank very hard, but the other boat moved further ahead in the mist all the time. Which of the following words best fits into the blank? A, work, B, worked, or C, working? So you know the drill by now. Pause the video, take your time, answer this, and then we'll go over it. So the correct answer here is C, working. And so I've highlighted the ing, the 3 letters at the end of the word rowing here. And this is kind of an example of parallel structure. And if you're not sure what parallel structure is, don't worry about it right now. I don't want to overload you in this video. But just note here that it's the rowing. If the earlier word in the sentence has ing like rowing does, that's a dead giveaway that it's probably going to be working. Another word that ends in ing instead of just work or worked. All right, so whenever you get a question like this, you can also just kind of sound it out in your head and you can go by which seems to fit the best, which seems like it makes the most sense, which sounds like it fits. All right, that's one way you can do these, but also look for parallel structure, things like this. Again, ing matched another word with ing right here. Okay, so the next part of the passage reads, "Where are we going, Dad?" Nick asked. "Over to the Indian camp. There is an Indian lady very sick." "Oh," said Nick. So the question here is, what type of literary device is this part of the passage an example of? And when I say this part of the passage, I just mean these 3 little blurbs I have on the screen right now. A, simile, B, dialogue, or C, metaphor. So you know the drill by now. Pause the video, try it out, and then we'll go over it. Okay, so the answer here is dialogue, and dialogue is just a fancy word for a conversation between 2 or more people. And dialogue is very important. You're definitely going to see fiction passages, almost definitely, on the GED Reading and Language Arts or Reasoning through Language Arts section. And dialogue, it's just conversation between 2 or more people. It really gives us deeper insight into the plot and the characters. And whenever you see dialogue and talking going back and forth in the RLA passages on your test, just keep your eye out here because those, typically you're going to get at least 1 question on dialogue, right? Where at least the parts of the passage where there's talking going back and forth, you're usually going to get some questions that come from those sections. Now, this is not a guarantee, but it's just something I've heard from a lot of test takers and seen on other practice tests myself. So just note that dialogue, not only does it give us deeper insight into the plot, but it can also be a source of potential questions on your test. Okay, so the next part says, across the bay they found the other boat beached. Uncle George was smoking a cigar in the dark. The young Indian pulled the boat way up on the beach. Uncle George gave both the Indians cigars. Okay, so the question here, what is the best inference for why Uncle George gave the Indians cigars based on the evidence in the passage? And it says passage, it has a B, that's a typo, it should say passage. So A, he decided to quit smoking and wanted to get rid of them. B, he owns a cigar company and wanted to give them free samples. Or C, as a way of thanking them for rowing their boats. So pause the video, you know the drill, try to figure this out, and then we'll go over it. Okay, so the answer here is C, as a way of thanking them for rowing their boats. So what you need to know about an inference, it's just an educated guess that you're going to have to make based off of the evidence in the story and your own experience. And so the thing with inferences is you really want to try to really understand the passage as well as you can when you're reading because, you know, here we don't know for sure. An inference, it's always a guess that you're making. There's no way to know for sure that you're right. For all we know, maybe he is trying to quit smoking, and so that's why he wanted to give one of the Indians one of the cigars, right? But there was nothing in the passage about him wanting to quit smoking. It said nothing about that. Also, it didn't mention him owning a cigar company, and it didn't say anything about wanting to give away free samples. So, it doesn't give any indication that he owns a business or anything like that. So that's why I would rule those two out right away, because nothing in the passage that had to do with these two things was mentioned. As a way of thanking them for rowing their boat. So it doesn't directly, this is why it's an inference. It doesn't directly say that this is why he's giving the Indians cigars. So maybe this is why he did it, maybe this is not. We're just making an educated guess here, but it seems like a safe bet that it's reasonable that they rowed the boats for them. So just as a way of saying thanks, he gives them cigars, or maybe that's kind of like his way of paying them for rowing the boats. But either way, C is the most logical inference here based off of the evidence from the passage. Okay, so the next part says, they walked up from the blank, through a meadow that was soaking wet with dew, following the young Indian who carried a lantern. Then they went into the woods and followed a trail that led to the logging road that ran back into the hills. It was much lighter on the logging road, as the timber was cut away on both sides. The young Indian stopped and blew out his lantern, and they all walked on along the road. Okay, so now here's the question again. It's which one of the following is most likely the word missing from the blank? So you can pause the video, try this out, and we'll go over it. Okay, so the correct answer here is B, it's beach. Now, it's not going to be the woods because it says that then they went into the woods. All right, so the word then basically tells us that this part came after the meadow, all right? And C doesn't quite fit, or at least it's not it's not the most logical guess here, because they're probably not going to walk from the meadow through a meadow, right? But B is going to be correct. And also just remember that it said in the last paragraph that they were on a beach, so it just makes sense that they'd be leaving from the beach going to the meadow. So words like from or then or to, those are kind of words that the author uses to structure the paragraphs, but they can help us understand the sequence of what's happening. So this is really kind of a way of just gauging, can you fill in the blank here? Can you use logic and reasoning to critically think your way through this? But also we're just kind of helping you, help you get a strategy to kind of figure out the sequencing of what's happening in the text. And that's what this question is about too. The sequence in following order of what's happening in the passages, and this is a very important skill to develop here. So this question says, suppose Nick wants to travel from the hills to the beach. Which best describes the path he'd take based on the text? Now I've emphasized the word from, okay, because that's going to be important here to you getting the question right. So pause the video, take your time with this one. Hopefully this isn't too challenging for you. Hopefully you can get the right answer here, but if not, don't worry about it. We're about to go over it. So pause the video and we'll go over it. Okay, so the correct answer here is C, all right? And so really what this comes down to is you have to, it's just critical thinking here, just analyzing what's going on in the text. And hopefully, now that you're in hopefully a relaxed setting, you don't have a time pressure right now like you would on the test. So hopefully, you're able to pause the video, take your time with this, because when the time's ticking down on the test, it's obviously going to be more stressful. But it's good to practice, hopefully when you're in a relaxed setting, which hopefully you are right now, obviously. I can't go to your house and see that, but what we're doing here is we're just using the context clues here, right? So we have to start from the hills, okay? And so it says here, if we just work backwards here, right? From the hills, so how do they get to the hills? Well, they have to go from the logging road, then they go to the hills. Well, how do they get on the logging road? Well, it says they went into the woods and followed a trail that led to the logging road. So now, how do they get to the woods? All right, well, first they had to go through the meadow. And the starting point was the beach. So they went from the beach through a meadow, then they went into the woods, took the woods on a trail to the logging road, which led to the hills. So we're just going backwards here. If you're starting at the hills, you're going hills. Going backwards, you'd most likely be going logging road, then woods, then meadow, then beach. So this is just kind of just following and just critically thinking your way through, just kind of just using your critical thinking skills to get the sequence, to get the question right. Okay, so next it says here, I have the last sentence highlighted, and the last sentence was, the young Indian stopped and blew out his lantern, and they all walked on along the road. So I just wanted to ask the question right here, why do you think the Indian blew out his lantern? And again, I highlighted that last sentence here because that's where it is. And I'd like you to pause the video, think up at least 2 different reasons, 2 different possible explanations for this, all right? You can write them out if you really want to. You can just think of them in the head. That's fine. But there's no right or wrong answers here. I just want you to think. So pause the video, do it now. Okay, so hopefully you had a chance to do that so far, and thank you for all the great work in watching this video so far. I know this is tedious, but I hope this is really going to help you out here. And so here are just 2 things I came up with here. So maybe the stars and the moon were so bright that maybe they didn't need the lantern anymore. Or maybe he didn't want to waste it. I'm not sure. There's really no right or wrong reason here, but whenever there's a detail at the end or at the beginning of a paragraph, you know, that might be giving you some good information, okay? Now, there could be good key information that's important in the middle of the paragraphs too, so obviously I'm not saying not to check the middle of paragraphs, but I want to emphasize here and give you a take-home message on this slide right now that, you know, if you're skimming and especially if you're short on time on the test, check the first sentence and the last sentence of the paragraphs, all right? Ideally, you'll read it all, but this is important here because, you know, this sentence here, this is helping us transition from a setting to a new setting, all right? So in this case, you know, it's already pretty clear they're traveling from the beach, they end up going on the logging road, etc., etc., and so here, he's blowing the lantern out, and we're about to find out why, but this last sentence here is transitioning us, is signaling that there's going to be a transition here to a new setting, all right? And like I said, whenever the setting changes, it's always really important to keep in mind. So there really was no right or wrong answer there. I just wanted to get you thinking critically. So it goes on to say here, they came around a bend, and a dog came out barking. Ahead were the lights of the shanties, where the Indian bark peelers lived. More blank rushed out at them. The 2 Indians sent them back to the shanties. In the shanty nearest the road, there was a light in the window. An old woman stood in the doorway holding a lamp. Question: which word best fits in the blank? And I just want to note here before I have you pause the video that, so basically what's happening in the story is, hopefully you saw that, is they blew out the lantern because they're coming into the camp. They're coming into that Indian camp. There's other lights there, so that's why. So we're changing the setting here, going from the traveling, now we're in the Indian camp. So just as you picture this mentally in your head, hopefully you can picture that new setting. Okay, so pause the video here and you can work on this question before I ramble on anymore. So you can pause the video, try this now. Okay, so the correct answer here is dogs, and A, what's wrong with A? Well, there doesn't really seem to be like any kind of battle or fight or confrontation going on, so it seems like they're friendly, right? Like they're coming to the Indian camp with the 2 Indians, and you know, there's a woman in the doorway, and it doesn't seem like there's any kind of battle or confrontation, so I don't think more Indians would rush out at them, right? Also, a boat it's an inanimate object, it's not a real thing, it's not a real living thing, it can't rush. In nurses, well, there's no mention of any kind of nurses or any nurses in the story, so I would rule that out, and that leaves us with C, dogs. Okay, so the next question says, which of the following is most likely the definition of the word shanty? And I've highlighted on the screen, or I should say I've bolded and I've underlined a couple uses of the word shanty here. So that way you can use that as a clue to figure this out, but I'd like you to pause the video, try to figure this out, and then as always, we'll go over it. Okay, so the correct answer here is A. It's a type of shelter such as a shack or a hut. So hopefully you were able to figure that out, but if not, good try anyway. So we'll keep going here. It says, inside on a wooden bunk lay a young Indian woman. She had been trying to have her baby for 2 days. All the old women in the camp had been helping her. The men had moved off up the road to sit in the dark and smoke out of range of the noise she made. She screamed just as Nick and the 2 Indians followed his father and Uncle George into the shanty. Okay, so the question here, how would you describe the conflict of this part of the story? Please try your best to put it in your own words. Okay, and so basically, you could pause the video, try this now, and then we'll go over it. Okay, so whether you did this on paper or did it in your head, I just wanted you to practice a really pivotal skill here, which is putting things in your own words, right? And the way I would do it here, and I had this on the screen for you to see, I would just very simply, just something like this, you know, there's a pregnant woman who's having some kind of problem or complication with childbirth that's causing her pain. That's really all we know that's going on here, but The conflict is just another word for the main problem that's happening. So as long as you came up with something like this, or thought it in your head or wrote out something like this, that there's a pregnant woman, some kind of problem going on with a childbirth, she's in pain, anything like that, anything along those lines, then you probably had an acceptable answer. And this is just a reminder, if you've seen my other reading comprehension videos, you've probably seen me show this slide before, but it bears repeating, and if not, then I'm really glad you're here right now. Welcome to the video and welcome to my channel if you haven't seen my videos before. But basically, I have this slide here to teach students to focus on what I call the SCCT, the setting, characters, conflict, and theme. All right, and I always tell people the first two are the most important. You want to nail down what the setting is whenever you start reading a story, and note wherever the setting is changing throughout the story. And again, this is going to have a big impact on your mental picture of what's going on in the story, the mental movie you're kind of creating in your head as you're reading the story. All right, because if a story is set in a big city and you're picturing it on a farm, all right, you've got the wrong mental picture, and obviously it's going to be very confusing what's happening. So that's part of the reason why setting is important, but obviously the obvious one is that you could and probably will, there's no guarantee, no one can predict for sure what's going to be on the GED test, but you're probably going to get at least one question on setting, all right, at some point. So you might get questions on setting, but it's also pivotal for your reading comprehension. Then 2 is the characters, nailing down who the characters are, especially the main characters. Supporting characters, you don't have to pay attention to quite as closely, but you want to nail down the setting, keep track of the characters, and if you do those 2 things, the conflict is going to be a lot easier to spot, and in this case, we just talked about the conflict. And then theme, we don't really have a clear theme yet at this point in the story, so we're not going to worry about theme right now, but just remember this, going into any fiction passage as you're reading it, just in your head, I need to find the SCCT, the setting, characters, conflict, theme. Okay, so let's keep rolling right along here. So it says, okay, so here we have, she lay in the lower bunk, very big, under a quilt. Her head was turned to one side. In the upper bunk was her husband. He had cut his foot very badly with an blank 3 days before. He was smoking a pipe. The room smelled very bad. Nick's father ordered some water to be put on the stove, and while it was heating, he spoke to Nick. So the question here, the word quilt most likely means which of the following? A, a type of drink, B, a type of bed covering, or C, a piece of clothing. So pause the video, try to figure this out, and then as always, we'll go over it. Okay, so the answer here is B, a type of bed covering, and you can rule A out because you can't go underneath the drink, right? So she's going under the quilt. You can't go under a drink unless you want to get wet. And a piece of clothing here, I can see why somebody would guess C. It could make sense. You could go underneath a piece of clothing, especially if you're cold or something like that. But what you really have to see here is the context. And the context here is that she's laying in a bunk, or in other words, a bed, like a bunk bed, right? It just says a bunk here, but I picture that just being like a bed. And it goes on to say, she's laying in a lower bunk. And so just from words like that, you would hopefully be able to figure out that, this has something to do with a bed or a bunk, and what has to do with a bed or a bunk? Well, obviously bed covering. So that would be my thought process for why B would be the right answer. Okay, so now we have another blank here, and it says, which word most likely belongs in the blank? A, apple, B, knife, C, axe, or D, razor. Pause the video, try this out. As always, then we'll go over it. So the answer here is axe, and there's a couple important lessons to take away from this one, but the first we just have to think critically here, right? So an apple, it's not going to be something sharp. An apple's not going to cut you, so we can rule that out. Now, a knife or an axe or a razor, these 3 things could all cut you, okay? But there's really one way to narrow it down here, and it has to do with that word an. So as a general rule of thumb, the word an comes before words that start with the vowel sound. And I don't want to overload you too much in this video with all kinds of different grammar rules and things like that, but vowel sounds are the A, E, I, O, and U, okay? Talked about vowels in other videos, but I just want you to note here that the correct answer is axe, and we know that because it says with an axe, all right? So it's that matching sound there, that and you have to have a word that has that vowel sound in front of it. Okay, so Next it says, "This lady is going to have a baby, Nick," he said. "I know," said Nick. "You don't know," said his father. "Listen to me. What she is going through is called being in labor. The baby wants to be born and she wants it to be born. All her muscles are trying to get the baby born. That is what is happening when she screams." "I see," Nick said. Just then the woman cried out. Okay, so your question here, based on the passage, what do you think Nick's father does for a career? I'd like you to pause the video and just try to think of a little list here. Brainstorm at least 2 different possibilities. You can write them down or just keep them in your head, either way. But there's no right or wrong answers. I just want to see what you come up with here. Okay, so 2 things that I thought of here right off the bat would be nurse or a doctor, really anything in the medical field. It seems like he knows something about delivering a baby, he knows something about labor, knows something about muscles, so I think it's a safe bet that it's something in the medical field. Like I said, no right or wrong answers. I just wanted you to have you practice your critical thinking skills here and just kind of making inferences and just reading the text and just kind of inferring. Well, you know, the father's doing something with the baby and it looks like he's trying to take care of the woman or maybe trying to deliver the baby. Who does that? Well, that would typically be a doctor or a nurse, maybe a midwife or a physician's assistant. So he probably does something in the medical field, all right? And so why is this so important? Well, again, like I said, losing track of different characters is a really common reason that people struggle with reading comprehension, all right? I'm sure you've had it happen to you before, maybe when you're practicing already, where you're just reading a passage and there's all these different characters and it's just not clear who does what and who's who, and it ends up being a jumbled mess where you have to reread things a bunch of times. And so you might still have to reread. Everyone has to go back and reread certain things, you know, every now and then, so there's no shame in that. But I just want you to know that a really good strategy for fixing this is whenever a new character is introduced, or especially whenever new information about characters is introduced, I want you to always just try to think of ways to tell that character apart. So in this case, if you picture the dad here as either some kind of maybe he's like a male nurse or a doctor, all right, it's way easier to keep track of that character and to remember who that character is and what his role is in the story if you have that clear mental picture of him as a doctor or a nurse or something like that. All right, maybe even, you know, picture him with like a stethoscope around his neck, however you want to picture the character. You know, some people, forming mental images in their head comes easier than others, but I'm just telling you here that, you know, the more that you can think of ways to differentiate the characters, the more you're going to keep track of them. It's going to be more easy for you to process the text on a deeper level, which is going to therefore get you a better score. Okay, so it says next, "Oh, Daddy, can't you give her something to make her stop screaming?" asked Nick. "No, I haven't any anesthetic," his father said. "But her screams are not important. I don't hear them because they are not important." Okay, so the next question, the word anesthetic most likely means which of the following? And you have answer choices A, B, C, or D. So pause the video, try to figure this out, and then as always, we'll go over it. So the answer here is D, a medication for treating pain. And you really just have to realize here that what's going on here is, you know, she's screaming in pain, and he's asking, is there something we can give her to make it stop? Well, what would you give somebody to stop the pain? Something like a medication or a shot or an injection, something like that. So that's how you would hopefully come to D as the right answer. Okay, so next it says, I've highlighted the text on the screen to focus on here, and it says, why do you think Nick's father says that he doesn't hear the woman's screams in the last sentence? So I'd like you to pause the video and just brainstorm at least a few different reasons. Okay, so just 2 things that came up to me. Maybe like he's cruel and he just doesn't care about her pain, he's just a jerk. Or possibly maybe he's just really focused on his job and focused on what he's doing, and he just has trained himself to kind of block that kind of thing out like a lot of doctors have to do. Just wanted to get you thinking here. And so, okay, so we keep going here. It says, the husband in the upper bunk rolled over against the wall. The woman in the kitchen motioned to the doctor that the water was hot. Nick's father went into the kitchen and poured about half of the water out of the big kettle into a basin. Into the water left in the kettle, he put several things he unwrapped from a handkerchief. So your next question is, the word basin most likely means which of the following? A, a container, B, a book, C, a body of water, or D, draining on the Earth's surface. So pause the video, try to figure this out, and then we'll go over it. Okay, so A is the correct answer. It's talking about a container here, and really you just have to reason your way through this and just think about the fact that they're pouring water into it. What would hold water? Well, some kind of container. Okay, so here's a little challenge here, and this is something that you should try to do on your test if you have time. Obviously, you don't want to take too much time, but pausing every now and then to do this I think will help your score. And the challenge here, or the trick you can take with you from here on out, is to come up with just one word for each of the following characters to help you remember the character. I don't want a sentence, I don't want 2 sentences. I just want you to think, Nick, what's one word that you could use to help you remember Nick's character? Nick's father, what's one word you could use, and so on and so forth. So pause the video, try to do this, and then we'll go over the answer here. I shouldn't say we'll go over the answer because it's going to be different for everybody else, but hopefully you know what I mean here. For Nick, I just said son, and for his father, I just obviously put doctor. And for Uncle George, all we really know about him is that he likes cigars, so I put cigars. And I hope that you can just see how now throughout the rest of the story, anytime Uncle George would come up, you could just remember, oh yeah, he's the guy that had cigars at the beginning, and whenever Nick's father comes up, you just remember, okay, well, he's the doctor, all right? And just by giving each character one word, preferably something visual like cigars, it's easy to visualize a cigar, or doctor, it's easy to picture hopefully what, a doctor. So you take from this what you will. If you want to use this trick going forward, I think it's going to help you out. And so the video's gone on too long already, so I just hope that this was helpful for you. If you want to finish the story, it's called The Indian Camp. You can Google it, and you can find it for free on the internet. It's a really old story, but really appreciate you sticking with me. I hope this video was helpful. Sorry I was so scatterbrained. I just wanted to get all the information out to you as fast as I could here.